Welcome to Midnight Whispers, the place where the cold breathes and the dark listens. Tonight we're bound for Alaska, land of endless snowfields, ghost towns under ice, and roads that end without warning. Up here, silence isn't empty, it's alive, waiting. The stories you're about to hear are true, drawn from legends, and whispered by those who swore they'd never tell. Subscribe now and tap the bell so the next time we drift into the cold, you're with us. Pull your blanket close, dim the lights, and let the first tale rise like a storm over the tundra. Story 1 to 1970, Anchorage Theater Fire. Voices in the ashes, I can smell smoke right now as I tell you this story. Even though I quit smoking 15 years ago, even though there is no fire anywhere near me, the smell follows me everywhere now, clinging to my clothes, my hair, my dreams. Sweet and acrid, like burning velvet mixed with something far worse. My name is David Morrison, and I am a demolition contractor from Seattle. 3 weeks ago, I took what I thought would be an easy job in Anchorage. Tear down the old Northway Theater on 5th Avenue. Built in 1971 on the exact spot where the original Northway had burned down the year before, killing 43 people in what remains Alaska's deadliest unsolved fire. I should have known better than to take a job tearing down a place built on top of a mass grave. The current owner, an elderly man named Frank Petrov, met me at the site on a gray October morning. The theater had been closed for 5 years after a series of what he called unfortunate incidents. Patrons complaining about smoke during movies, false fire alarms, people claiming they heard screaming coming from empty seats. Frank handed me the keys and a check for twice my usual rate. The only condition was that I had to work alone and finish the job within 2 weeks. He wouldn't explain why, just kept glancing nervously at the boarded-up entrance and muttering about finally putting the dead to rest. The Northway Theater looked like every other abandoned building from the outside. Faded brick facade, broken marquee letters scattered on the sidewalk, windows covered with plywood that had been tagged by decades of graffiti. But something felt wrong about the place from the moment I stepped inside. The lobby still smelled like smoke. Not old smoke, not the stale odor you'd expect from a building that had been closed for years. Fresh smoke, like someone had just extinguished a cigarette or snuffed out a candle. I checked every room, every corner, looking for signs of squatters or recent fires. Nothing, just that persistent smell hanging in the air like an invisible fog. I started with the lobby, stripping out the old carpet and fixtures. Underneath the threadbare burgundy carpeting, I found something that made my blood run cold. Scorch marks, deep black burns scarred into the wooden subfloor, arranged in patterns that looked almost like human shapes. Dozens of them, scattered across the entire lobby floor. These weren't from the 1971 renovation. The burns went straight through the wood, down to the concrete foundation below. They were from the original fire, somehow preserved under 50 years of carpet and denial. That first night, I stayed late to get ahead of schedule. Around 9 o'clock, as I was loading debris into my truck, I heard something that stopped me dead in my tracks. Applause, faint but unmistakable. The sound of an audience clapping drifted from inside the empty theater. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, then faded into silence. I grabbed my flashlight and went back inside, checking every row, every aisle, every corner of the building. Empty, completely empty. But the seats in the front 3 rows were still warm to the touch. The next morning, I called Frank Petrov to ask about the building, its history. What he told me about the original fire made everything click into place. December 15th, 1970. A Tuesday night showing of Love Story. 312 people packed into a theater built for 200. The fire started during the second act, somewhere near the screen. Within minutes, the entire building was engulfed. The official investigation blamed faulty electrical wiring, but witness accounts told a different story. Survivors described the fire as unnatural, spreading too fast, burning too hot. The flames seemed to chase people, cutting off escape routes, herding them toward the center of the theater where the heat was most intense. 43 people died that night, most from smoke inhalation. Their bodies were found clustered together in the front rows, as if they had been trying to get as close to the screen as possible when the smoke overtook them. The strangest detail was that several witnesses reported hearing the victims applauding even as the flames consumed them. On my third day of demolition, I found the projection booth. The door had been painted over so many times that it was almost invisible, blending into the wall of the upper lobby. Inside, Everything was exactly as it had been left in 1970. Film canisters stacked on metal shelves, a vintage carbon arc projector still aimed toward the theater below, and sitting on the operator's chair, a half-melted reel of love story. I touched the film canister, and suddenly I could hear them. Voices, hundreds of them, whispering in unison from somewhere deep within the walls. They spoke in overlapping fragments, incomplete sentences that seemed to be commenting on a movie that wasn't playing. That is when she turns around. Oh God, she is so beautiful. Why is it getting so warm in here? The fire, somebody help us. But look at her face in that scene. We can't leave now. We have to see how it ends. The voices grew louder, more distinct, and I realized with growing horror that I was listening to the final thoughts of everyone who died in the original fire. Somehow, their consciousness had been burned into the very structure of the building, trapped forever in an endless loop of that terrible night. I tried to leave the projection booth, but the door wouldn't budge. The temperature began to rise rapidly, and smoke started seeping through the walls. Real smoke, thick and choking, filling the small room until I could barely breathe. Then I saw them, shadows moving in the theater below, visible through the projection window. Dozens of human silhouettes filing into the seats, sitting down in perfect order, all facing the blank screen with eager anticipation. The smoke grew thicker, and I could hear the crackle of flames somewhere in the distance. I was witnessing the fire of 1970, replaying itself exactly as it had happened 53 years ago. The shadows in the seats began to applaud as invisible flames spread across the screen. They clapped enthusiastically even as smoke filled the theater, even as the temperature climbed to unbearable levels. They were trapped in their final moments, doomed to experience their deaths over and over again, but somehow still finding joy in the movie they would never finish watching. I finally managed to force the door open and stumbled out of the projection booth, gasping for fresh air. But the fresh air never came. The entire theater was now filled with smoke, and I could hear the voices of the dead getting louder and more insistent. Don, to leave. You have to stay. You have to see how it ends. The movie isn't over yet. I ran for the exit, but the lobby doors were sealed shut. The handles burned my hands when I touched them, and I could see flames dancing behind the frosted glass. The fire was spreading again, just like it had in 1970, following the exact same pattern. That is when I understood the terrible truth about the Northway Theater. The fire never really ended. It had been burning continuously for 53 years, invisible to the living world but absolutely real to the dead. The 1971 reconstruction hadn't built a new theater on the site of the old one. It had built a prison to contain the fire and everyone who died in it. I was about to become the 44th victim. The smoke was so thick now that I could barely see my own hands. The voices of the dead surrounded me, welcoming me to their eternal audience, promising me that the movie was almost over, that I would love the ending. But I didn't want to see the ending. I wanted to live. I found a fire axe mounted on the lobby wall and started chopping through the nearest boarded window. The wood was hot to the touch and seemed to resist the axe blade, as if the building itself was fighting to keep me inside. Behind me, I could hear the dead taking their seats, settling in for another showing of the movie that killed them. I finally broke through the window and tumbled out onto Fifth Avenue, landing hard on the frozen sidewalk. When I looked back at the theater, everything appeared normal. No smoke, no flames, no signs of the supernatural inferno raging inside. But I could still hear them applauding. I called Frank Petrov that night and told him I was quitting the job. I didn't. He explained why, just said I couldn't finish the work. He didn't. He seemed surprised. He told me that 17 other contractors had tried to demolish the Northway Theater over the past 50 years. None of them had ever completed the job. That was 3 weeks ago. I'd been back in Seattle ever since, trying to forget what happened in that cursed building. But the dead won. Let me go. I smell smoke everywhere I go now. I hear their voices whispering in quiet movie theaters, commenting on films I'm trying to watch. And every night, I dream about Love Story. I see Jenny and Oliver falling in love on that big screen, and I hear the audience murmuring appreciatively in the darkness around me. The movie plays all the way through, and when it ends, everyone applauds. Then the fire starts again. Last night, I realized something that made my blood turn to ice. In my dreams, I'm not watching the fire from outside anymore. I'm sitting in the front row, applauding with everyone else, feeling the heat on my face and smiling because the movie was so beautiful. I think part of me never really left the Northway Theater. I think part of me is still sitting in that audience, waiting for the credits to roll, waiting for the fire to finally burn out. But some fires never stop burning, and some audiences never stop applauding, even when they re-dead. Story 2. Missing 9 from Point Hope. They never found the bodies. Not one. 9 people gone. They just vanished from a village of 300 without leaving a trace. But that was exactly what happened in Point Hope, Alaska, on March 15th, 1967. And I know because I was supposed to be the 10th. My name is Robert Tikiewicz, and I'm probably the only person alive who knows what really took them that night. I've kept this secret for 56 years, but the nightmares are getting worse, and I can feel something calling me back to that cursed place at the edge of the world. Point Hope sits on a spit of land jutting into the Chukchi Sea, so far north that the sun doesn't rise for 2 months every winter. It's one of the oldest continuously inhabited places in North America, where my Inupiat ancestors have hunted whales for over 2,000 years. The village has survived everything the Arctic could throw at it, but it wasn't prepared for what came from beneath the ice. In March of 1967, I was 23 years old and working as a translator for a government survey team mapping mineral deposits along the coast. The missing 9 were all people I knew well. My uncle Samuel, the village whaling captain, Mary Kanguk, who taught at the local school, the Otena family, all 5 of them, including their twin boys who were barely 16, and Thomas Anangnishiguk, the village elder who claimed he could speak to the spirits that lived under the sea. They disappeared on the night of the spring equinox, during what should have been a celebration. The whaling season was about to begin, and the entire village had gathered in the community center for the traditional blessing ceremony. But as the evening wore on, people started drifting home in small groups, the way they always did after these gatherings. The 9 never made it home. Their families found warm dinners still sitting on kitchen tables, front doors left wide open to the Arctic wind, and no signs of struggle anywhere. It was as if they had simply walked out of their houses and evaporated into the night air. The search began immediately. Every able-bodied person in Point Hope spread out across the tundra, following tracks in the snow, checking every possible hiding place within 50 miles of the village. The Coast Guard flew helicopters up from Kotzebue. State troopers brought in search dogs. For 3 weeks, we combed every inch of the surrounding wilderness. We found nothing. No footprints leading away from the village. No abandoned clothing. No disturbed snow where bodies might be buried. The missing 9 had vanished as completely as if they had never existed at all. But I knew they hadn't just wandered off into the wilderness to die. Because the night they disappeared, I saw what took them. I had been walking home from the community center around 11 o'clock, taking the long road along the shore because the northern lights were particularly bright that evening. The aurora painted the ice-covered sea in shades of green and blue, dancing across the sky in patterns that seemed almost alive. That's when I saw the hole in the ice. It was perfectly circular, about 20 feet across, filled with dark water that reflected the lights above like a massive eye staring up at the stars. Steam rose from the opening, which was impossible because the sea temperature was well below freezing. But what made my blood run cold was what I could see moving beneath the surface. Lights, dozens of them, pulsing in rhythm like a slow heartbeat, ascending from the depths toward the hole in the ice. They weren't the right color for any fish or sea life I knew. These lights were pure white, so bright they hurt to look at directly, and they moved with purpose and intelligence. I should have run back to the village immediately to warn everyone. Instead, I hid behind a pressure ridge of ice and watched in fascination as something began to emerge from the hole. It wasn't like anything I had ever seen before. The closest I can come to describing it is an octopus, but one made of liquid light instead of flesh. Tentacles of pure energy writhed up through the hole, reaching across the ice toward the village. Each tentacle was at least 50 feet long and seemed to pulse with that same cold, white glow. And then I heard it calling. Not with sound, but directly into my mind. A voice that felt ancient beyond human comprehension, speaking in a language I had never heard but somehow understood perfectly. It was calling names, the names of the missing 9. Samuel, Mary, the Otena family, Thomas, and then it called my name. The voice in my head was so compelling, so absolutely commanding, that I found myself standing up from behind the ice ridge and walking toward the hole. I had no control over my own body. My legs moved without my permission. carrying me across the frozen sea toward that thing of light and hunger. But as I got closer, something saved me. My grandmother's amulet, a carved walrus tusk that she had given me as protection against the spirits of the deep. It grew burning hot against my chest, so hot that it seared my skin through my shirt. The pain snapped me out of the creature, this mental control just long enough to turn and run. I sprinted back toward the village as fast as I could, but I could hear the thing pursuing me across the ice. Not physically, but mentally. Its voice followed me, growing more insistent and angry with each step. It promised me wonders beyond imagination if I would just turn around and walk back to the hole. It showed me visions of cities beneath the sea, of knowledge that would make me the greatest man who ever lived, of power over life and death itself. I almost turned around 3 times before I made it back to the village. The next morning, we discovered that 9 people were missing. I wanted to tell the search teams about what I had seen. But who would have believed me? A monster made of light living under the ice? A voice that could control human minds? It sounded like the ravings of a madman, even to me. So I kept quiet and helped with the search, all the while knowing that we would never find the missing 9. They were somewhere far beneath the Chukchi Sea, in places where human beings were never meant to go. The official investigation concluded that the 9 had suffered from some kind of mass psychotic episode, probably brought on by the isolation and darkness of the Arctic winter. The case was closed and filed away, just another unsolved mystery from the frontier. But the disappearances didn't stop there. Over the next 30 years, people continued to vanish from Point Hope. Never more than 2 or 3 at a time, and always during the dark months when the sea was frozen solid. The village population slowly dwindled as families moved away, unwilling to risk losing their loved ones to whatever force was taking people. I moved to Anchorage in 1975, got married, had children, and tried to build a normal life far from the cursed village of my birth. But I never forgot what I saw that night, and I never stopped having the dreams. In my dreams, walking across the ice toward that hole in the frozen sea. The creature of light is waiting for me, its tentacles reaching up through the dark water like welcoming arms. And standing at the edge of the hole, beckoning me closer, are the missing 9. They haven't aged a day since 1967. They look exactly as they did the night they disappeared, but their eyes are different now, filled with that same cold, white light that pulsed beneath the ice. They tell me about the wonders they've seen in the cities below, about the knowledge they gained from their new masters. They tell me it's time for me to join them. The dreams started coming every night about 6 months ago. And 3 weeks ago, I began sleepwalking. My wife found me standing in our driveway at 3 in the morning, dressed only in my underwear, staring north toward Point Hope. I can feel it calling to me again after all these years. The thing beneath the ice remembers that I got away, and it wants to finish what it started in 1967. The protection my grandmother's amulet provided is wearing thin with age, and I don't think I can resist much longer. That's why I'm telling this story now, while I still can. Because I know I'm going to go back to Point Hope. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. The call is getting stronger every day, and I'm getting weaker. When I do go back, I want to be returning alone. I'll be bringing others with me, people who don't even know they've been chosen yet. The creature's influence spreads further with each passing year, and it is getting better at hiding its true nature behind seemingly rational thoughts and normal impulses. So if you ever find yourself with an inexplicable urge to visit the northernmost village in Alaska, if you suddenly develop a fascination with whaling culture or Arctic exploration, if you start having dreams about cities of light beneath the polar ice, then you need to stay as far away from Point Hope as possible. Because the missing 9 are still down there, waiting in the dark water beneath the frozen sea. And they were always looking for new friends to join them in their eternal celebration of the spring equinox. The hole in the ice never really closes. It just moves to wherever it needs to be to collect its harvest. And this year, I think it's moving south. Story 3. Salcha River Files. I never believed in evil until I saw what happened on the Salcha River. The official report called it a bear attack, but bears don't arrange furniture into perfect circles. My name is Detective Ray Morrison, Alaska State Troopers. 32 years on the force, and I still wake up screaming about what I found in that cabin. The case files say it was closed in 1978, but some cases never really close. They just burrow deeper into your skull until they become part of you. It started with a radio call on October 15, 1977. Missing persons report for the Hendricks family. Tom, Sarah, and their twin boys, Jake and Michael, age 12. Homesteaders who lived 60 miles northeast of Fairbanks, right along the Salcha River. Their nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, a trapper named Eddie Kaczynski who checked on them monthly during the harsh months. Eddie found their door hanging open like a broken jaw. The drive out there took me 3 hours through roads that barely qualified as dirt paths. Alaska in October means darkness comes fast and stays long. By the time I reached the Hendricks place, my headlights were cutting through wilderness so thick it felt like driving into a throat. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by black spruce and birch trees. Nothing unusual about the structure itself. Standard log construction, maybe 20 by 30 feet, with a stone chimney and a small porch. What made my blood freeze was the silence. No wind, no animal sounds. Even my boots on the frozen ground seemed muffled, like something was swallowing the noise. Eddie met me at the tree line, his weathered face pale as bone. He pointed at the cabin without speaking, then walked back to his truck and drove away. Never saw him again after that night. The front door had been torn from its hinges, but not from the outside. The heavy wooden door, reinforced with iron brackets Tom had installed himself, had been destroyed from within. Splinters and metal scattered across the porch like someone had detonated a bomb inside the cabin. But bombs don't leave claw marks. 4 parallel gouges ran along the door frame, each one exactly 2 inches apart and deep enough to reach the core wood. Too precise for a bear. Too large for any predator I knew. I measured them 3 times, photographed them from every angle, but the pictures never came out right. The scratches seemed to shift in the camera viewfinder, like they were alive. Inside, the cabin told a story that made no sense. The living room furniture had been moved into a perfect circle in the center of the room. 2 chairs, a small sofa, and a coffee table, arranged with mathematical precision. I checked the measurements later. Each piece sat exactly 4 feet from the center point, facing inward like they were having a conversation with something invisible. The kitchen table had been flipped upside down and positioned in the exact center of the circle. On its surface, someone had arranged the family's belongings in neat rows. Tom, his watch. Sarah, his wedding ring. The boys, baseball gloves. Each item placed with deliberate care, like offerings on an altar. But there was no blood. No signs of struggle beyond the destroyed door. No bodies. The strangest detail was the calendar hanging on the kitchen wall. October 15th was circled in red ink, but so were 13 other dates going back to January. I copied down every marked date. Spent weeks trying to find a pattern. Full moons, weather events, religious holidays. Nothing connected them except that red circle drawn in the same hand. The Hendricks family had simply vanished. I interviewed everyone within 50 miles. The Hendricks were quiet, hard-working people who kept to themselves but never caused trouble. Tom worked construction jobs in Fairbanks during summer months. Sarah homeschooled the boys and sold handmade crafts at the weekend markets. Normal family living an isolated but peaceful life. Until I found the journal. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the master bedroom, wrapped in oilcloth, was Sarah's diary. The entries started normal enough. Weather observations, household chores, the boys, progress with their studies. But beginning in March, her handwriting changed, became shakier, more urgent. The words themselves grew darker. March 18th, something watches us from the tree line after dark. Tom says it's just wildlife, but animals don't. They stand perfectly still for hours. April 2nd, found tracks around the cabin this morning. Not bear, not moose. Something walking on 2 legs but with claws instead of feet. The tracks form a complete circle around our home. April 20th, the boys are having the same nightmare. They wake up screaming about the tall man who wants to come inside. I'm starting to have the dreams too. May 15th, it spoke to me today. Not words, but I understood. It wants us to invite it in. Says we have been chosen for something special. Tom thinks I am losing my mind. Maybe I am. The final entry was dated October 14th, 1 day before they disappeared. It is coming tonight. Tom finally saw it standing at the edge of the clearing. 9 feet tall, thin as a scarecrow, with arms that reach almost to the ground. Its face ISN, T-right? Too many angles, like someone drew a person from memory and got the proportions wrong. We tried to leave this afternoon, but the truck won. T-start and the radio is dead. The boys are calm now. They say the tall man explained everything. We're going to be part of something wonderful. I can hear it breathing outside the walls. I radioed for backup and spent the next 2 days combing the area with 6 other troopers and a team of volunteer searchers. We found no trace of the family, but we discovered something else that made me request a transfer to Anchorage. Half a mile downstream along the Salcha River, we found a clearing where the ground was scorched black in a perfect circle 30 feet across. Nothing grew there, not a single blade of grass or seedling. The earth itself felt wrong, like it was radiating cold instead of absorbing heat from the sun. In the center of the circle stood 13 wooden posts, each exactly 7 feet tall, arranged in the same pattern as the dates marked on the calendar. Carved into each post was a name. The Hendricks family occupied posts number 10 through 13. 9 other posts bore names of people I'd never heard of, but when I ran them through missing persons databases, they all matched unsolved disappearances throughout Alaska over the past 6 years. All families, all homesteaders living in remote locations, all vanished without a trace. The case was officially closed 3 weeks later. The district attorney decided a bear attack was the most reasonable explanation, despite the lack of bodies or blood. The arranged furniture was attributed to scavengers. The journal was deemed unreliable due to Sarah's deteriorating mental state. My photographs of the claw marks and the scorched clearing were mysteriously corrupted during processing. But I kept copies of everything. I returned to the Hendricks cabin exactly 1 year later, on October 15, 1978. The structure had been abandoned to the elements, but something had maintained the furniture arrangement. The circle remained perfect, undisturbed by wind or weather. Fresh scratches marked the walls, counting down numbers I couldn't decipher. That is when I saw it. Standing at the tree line, perfectly motionless, was the silhouette Sarah had described. 9 feet tall, impossibly thin, with arms that hung like broken branches. It watched me for what felt like hours, though my watch insisted only minutes had passed. When I finally worked up the courage to approach, it melted backward into the forest without making a sound. I never filed an official report about that encounter. Instead, I submitted my resignation the following Monday and moved to Oregon, as far from Alaska as my pension could take me. But distance doesn't matter when something has marked you. I still dream about the tall man, and sometimes I wake to find my furniture rearranged in perfect circles. The Hendricks case remains officially closed, but I know better. Whatever took that family is still out there, still collecting names for posts in that scorched clearing. Still waiting for the right people to invite it in. And here is what terrifies me most. Last week, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a calendar with October 15th circled in red ink. The same handwriting, the same careful circle. My name is Detective Ray Morrison, and I'm telling you this story because tomorrow is October 15th. My furniture has been moving by itself. My doors stay locked, and something 9 feet tall is standing in my backyard, perfectly still, waiting for me to understand. Some things are worse than death. Some things collect you piece by piece until nothing remains but your name carved into wood, marking the spot where your family used to exist. The official files say the Hendricks family died from a bear attack, but bears don to arrange furniture into perfect circles. And they certainly don if you count down the days until they come for you next. Story 4. Cursed gold of the Kennecott mines. The copper in Shaft 7 wasn't supposed to be there, and the 17 men who died trying to extract it should have listened to the warnings carved into the tunnel walls. My name is Thomas Fletcher, and I am a mining engineer with 31 years of experience in operations across 3 continents. I've worked everything from coal mines in West Virginia to diamond operations in South Africa. But nothing in my career prepared me for what I discovered in the abandoned tunnels beneath the Kennecott copper mine in Alaska during the summer of 2018. I was hired by Meridian Mining Corporation to conduct a feasibility study on reopening portions of the historic Kennecott operation. The original mine had closed in 1938 after 27 years of pulling copper ore from the Wrangell Mountains. But recent geological surveys suggested there might be untapped deposits still waiting in the deeper tunnels. Kennecott sits in the middle of nowhere, about 300 miles east of Anchorage in what is now Wrangell-St. Elias National Park. The ghost town is a tourist attraction these days, but in its heyday, it was one of the richest copper mines in the world. The company pulled over $200 million worth of ore from those mountains before the easily accessible deposits ran out. I flew in with a small survey team in late June, when the Alaska summer provides nearly 20 hours of daylight. We set up base camp in one of the restored buildings and began mapping the tunnel systems that hadn't been explored in over 80 years. Most of the main shafts were well documented, but there were rumors of secondary tunnels that had been sealed and forgotten. That's how we found Shaft 7. It wasn't on any of the original mining company maps. The entrance had been deliberately concealed behind a false wall in Tunnel C, about 800 feet below ground level. When we broke through the barrier, we found a hand-carved inscription in the stone above the opening. The words were rough and desperate looking, like someone had scratched them into the rock with a chisel in a hurry. It said, "He promised riches beyond measure. He delivered death beyond counting. May God forgive us for what we unleashed." Below that was a date, March 15th, 1937. My team wanted to seal the tunnel back up and pretend we never found it. But I was curious about what had driven the original miners to hide this shaft so thoroughly. We entered with full safety equipment, gas monitors, and emergency communications gear. The tunnel sloped downward at a steep angle, following a vein of ore that glowed with an unusual green tint in our headlamps. The first thing I noticed was how warm it was. Most mine tunnels maintain a constant cool temperature year-round, but Shaft 7 felt like walking into a heated building. The air had a metallic taste and carried a sound I never encountered before in underground work. A low, rhythmic humming that seemed to come from the walls themselves. About 200 feet down the tunnel, we found the first body. It was perfectly preserved, mummified by some combination of mineral deposits and the unusual atmospheric conditions in the shaft. The corpse wore mining clothes from the 1930s and clutched a handwritten journal against its chest. According to the identity card still in his pocket, this was Henry Kowalski, age 28, employed by Kennecott from 1935 until his disappearance in March 1937. I read his journal by headlamp light while my team documented the scene. The entries started normally enough, describing routine mining operations and complaints about the harsh Alaska winter. But as the weeks progressed, Henry's writing became increasingly erratic and disturbing. February 12, 1937. Jack Meredith found something in the deep tunnels today. Claims it is the richest copper vein he has ever seen. But there is something wrong about it. The ore glows in the dark and feels warm to the touch. Management wants us to keep working the deposit, but half the men are talking about quitting. February 20th, 1937. 3 more accidents this week. Tommy Brennan got his hand crushed when a support beam collapsed for no reason. Said he heard voices telling him to reach into a gap in the wall just before it happened. Doc Patterson thinks it's just the isolation getting to us. But I know better. There's something down there in Shaft 7, and it doesn't want us digging. March 3rd, 1937. Jack made some kind of deal. Want to talk about the details, but he is different now. Eyes are too bright, and he smiles at things that aren't funny. Says the entity promised to make us all rich beyond our wildest dreams if we just keep digging deeper. The other men are starting to follow him like he is some kind of prophet. The final entry was dated March 14th, 1937, just one day before the inscription above the tunnel entrance. They were all dead or mad. Jack led them deeper into the tunnels 3 days ago, following that cursed vein of copper. I can hear them down there, screaming and laughing at the same time. Whatever Jack promised that thing in exchange for riches, it is collecting its payment now. I am sealing this tunnel and praying to God that nobody ever finds it again. We continued deeper into Shaft 7 and found 16 more bodies, all perfectly preserved, all clutching mining tools or pieces of the strange green copper. Their faces were frozen in expressions of terror and ecstasy, like they experienced something wonderful and horrible at the same time. The tunnel ended in a circular chamber about 50 feet across, with walls that were completely covered in the glowing copper ore. But it wasn't just embedded in the rock. The copper had grown in organic patterns, forming spirals and symbols that hurt to look at directly. And in the center of the chamber was a pit that descended into absolute darkness. The humming sound was louder here, rising and falling in patterns that almost sounded like breathing. When I peered over the edge of the pit with my headlamp, I could see copper deposits forming geometric shapes along the walls as they descended beyond the reach of my light. But there was something else down there, something moving. That's when I found Jack Meredith. He was sitting on a ledge about 20 feet down the pit, his legs dangling over the edge like a child sitting on a dock. His mining clothes had partially dissolved, revealing skin that was streaked with green copper veins. When my light hit him, he looked up and smiled with teeth that gleamed like polished metal. He spoke in a voice that echoed strangely in the confined space. telling me about the bargain he made with the entity that lived in the deep places beneath the mountain. It had offered him unlimited wealth in exchange for feeding it the life force of his fellow miners. But Jack had been greedy, trying to take more than his share of the promised riches. The entity had punished him by trapping him in the pit for over 80 years, slowly transforming his body into living copper while keeping his consciousness intact to experience every moment of the change. He was a warning and a guardian, ensuring that nobody else would be able to make the same mistake he had. But Jack had learned patience during his decades of imprisonment, and he was eager to make a new deal with fresh victims. The copper veins in the chamber walls began to pulse with brighter light, and I could feel heat radiating from them like they were furnaces. My team started backing toward the tunnel entrance, but the passage behind us was changing. The walls were growing together, sealing us inside the chamber with Jack and whatever lived in the pit below him. That is when I understood the truth about Shaft 7. It wasn't a copper mine at all. It was a feeding chamber for something ancient and hungry that had been sleeping beneath the Wrangell Mountains for countless centuries. The miners in 1937 had accidentally broken through into its domain, and Jack Meredith had been desperate enough to make a bargain that doomed his entire crew. The entity in the pit was offering me the same choice: unlimited wealth and power in exchange for the lives of my survey team. All I had to do was push them over the edge, and I would become richer than anyone had ever dreamed possible. For a moment, standing in that copper-lined chamber with my colleagues backing away in terror, the temptation was overwhelming. I was 54 years old, divorced, with a daughter who barely spoke to me and a retirement account that wouldn't last 5 years. The promise of enough wealth to solve all my problems was seductive beyond belief. But I read Henry Kowalski's journal. I'd seen what the entity's promises had done to Jack Meredith and his crew. Whatever riches it offered came with a price that no sane person would willingly pay. I grabbed my emergency charges, small explosive devices we used for clearing rock falls, and threw them down into the pit. The blast echoed through the chamber like thunder, and Jack Meredith's screams of rage followed the explosion as debris rained down from above. The tunnel behind us cracked open, giving us a narrow escape route back to the surface. We ran through collapsing passages as the mountain shook around us, following our emergency rope back toward the main tunnel system. Behind us, I could hear something massive moving through the deep places, angry at being denied its promised feast. We made it back to base camp and called for immediate evacuation. The official report blamed the tunnel collapse on unstable geological conditions and recommended that the area be permanently sealed. Meridian Mining Corporation abandoned their plans to reopen Kennecott, citing safety concerns and budget constraints. But I know the real reason they walked away from millions of dollars worth of potential mining rights. I kept copies of Henry Kowalski's journal and the photographs we took in Shaft 7. Sometimes, late at night, I study the images of those copper formations and try to understand what kind of entity could offer such terrible bargains. The patterns in the metal seem to shift when I am not looking directly at them, forming symbols that suggest intelligence and malevolence beyond human comprehension. 6 months after the Kennecott expedition, I started receiving job offers from mining companies I never heard of. Lucrative positions in remote locations around the world, always involving the exploration of deep, previously unmapped tunnel systems. The salary offers were far beyond anything I'd ever been paid, and the signing bonuses alone would have solved all my financial problems. But I learned to recognize the smell of brimstone disguised as opportunity. These weren't legitimate mining operations. They were recruitment attempts by an entity that had spent over 80 years learning how to be more subtle about acquiring the human sacrifices it needed to maintain its earthly presence. I declined every offer and took early retirement from mining engineering. Now I work as a safety inspector for small construction companies, a job that keeps me firmly above ground and away from the deep places where ancient things wait with impossible bargains. But sometimes I dream about Shaft 7, and in those dreams, Jack Meredith is still sitting on his ledge in the pit, smiling his copper-toothed smile and whispering about riches beyond measure. He tells me the entity is patient, that it has all the time in the world to find new miners willing to make the same bargain he made in 1937. And every few months, I read news reports about mining accidents in remote locations, cave-ins that kill entire crews, equipment failures that crush experienced workers, explosions that leave no survivors and no explanations. The Kennecott entity is still active, still making its deals with desperate people who think they can outsmart something that has been offering impossible bargains since before human civilization began. And every time someone accepts its terms, 17 more bodies are added to the collection of perfectly preserved warnings that nobody ever seems to heed. If you ever find yourself in a situation where someone offers you riches beyond measure in exchange for something that seems insignificant, remember what happened in Shaft 7. Remember Jack Meredith and his crew of 17 dead miners? And ask yourself if any amount of wealth is worth spending eternity as a living advertisement for the consequences of greed. The cursed gold of the Kennecott mines is still there, glowing green in the darkness 800 feet below ground, waiting for the next group of treasure hunters to break through the seals and ignore the warnings carved into the tunnel walls. And when they do, the entity in the pit will be ready with its ancient offer, promising riches beyond measure to anyone foolish enough to believe that some bargains are worth making. If you're still listening, thank you. Midnight Whispers lives on your subscriptions and your stories. So hit subscribe, ring the bell, and tell us where you're watching from. Alaska's dark has a way of finding people, even far away. Story 5. Ghost lights of the Dalton Highway. The lights started following me at mile marker 175, and by mile marker 200, I knew I was going to die on the haul road. My name is Marcus Webb, and I've been driving 18-wheelers for 22 years. Coast to coast, border to border, every highway and back road you can imagine. But nothing prepared me for what happened during my third run up the Dalton Highway in October 2019. They call it the loneliest road in America, and after what I experienced, I understand why some drivers never come back. The Dalton Highway stretches 414 miles from Fairbanks to the oil fields of Prudhoe Bay. It is a gravel and dirt road that cuts through the most isolated wilderness on the continent. No gas stations for hundreds of miles, no cell service, no help if something goes wrong. Just you, your rig, and the endless Alaskan tundra stretching to the horizon. I was hauling drilling equipment north for a 3-day turnaround. The load was heavy, my truck was running smooth, and the weather forecast looked clear. Everything seemed routine until the sun started setting around mile marker 150. That's when I first noticed them in my mirrors. At first, I thought they were headlights from another truck maybe a mile behind me. Two pale orbs of light keeping pace with my rig. But as the darkness deepened, something felt wrong about them. The lights were too close together, too perfectly round, and they seemed to float about 10 feet off the ground. I heard the stories, of course. Every trucker who runs the Dalton Highway has heard about the ghost lights. Mysterious orbs that appear out of nowhere and follow vehicles for miles. Most drivers laugh it off as exhaustion or Arctic mirages, but sitting behind the wheel of 40 tons of truck and trailer, watching those lights hold perfect formation in my mirrors, I wasn't too laughing. The first hour wasn't too bad. The lights stayed about a quarter mile back, matching my speed exactly. When I accelerated, they accelerated. When I slowed down for rough patches of road, they slowed down too. I tried to convince myself it was just another trucker running without his headlights properly adjusted. But then my radio started acting up. The CB crackled with static at first, just white noise mixed with the occasional burst of interference. Then the static began forming patterns. Long bursts, short bursts, like some kind of code being transmitted on my frequency. I tried switching channels, but the interference followed me across the entire band. That's when I heard the voices. They were faint at first, barely audible over the static. Men speaking in urgent whispers, words I couldn't quite make out. The voices had an old-fashioned quality to them, like recordings from decades past. And underneath the whispers was another sound, the steady rumble of diesel engines. I pulled over at a wide spot in the road and climbed out of my cab to check my equipment. The October air hit me like a physical blow, so cold it made my lungs ache. Above me, the aurora borealis painted the sky in shifting curtains of green and blue light. Behind me, about 200 yards back, the mysterious lights had stopped as well. They were definitely not headlights. The orbs pulsed with their own inner radiance, casting no beams, throwing no shadows on the ground. They hovered motionless in the darkness like two watching eyes. And as I stood there in the Arctic wind, I could swear I heard something else. The distant sound of an air horn echoing across the tundra. I got back in my truck and kept driving. What else could I do? The nearest town was Coldfoot, still 100 miles ahead. Behind me was nothing but empty road stretching back to Fairbanks. I was committed to the route whether I liked it or not. The lights began moving closer around mile marker 200. What had been a quarter-mile gap slowly shrunk to an eighth of a mile, then 100 yards. The static on my radio grew louder, and the whispered voices became more distinct. I started to make out individual words, names, dates, locations along the highway. Then I heard my own name, Marcus Webb, Kenworth T800, northbound at mile 203. The voice was matter-of-fact, like a dispatcher calling out coordinates. But no dispatcher knew my exact location on that empty stretch of road. My GPS wasn't even working properly in the magnetic interference of the far north. That is when my engine started missing. A Caterpillar C15 diesel doesn't just start running rough for no reason. These engines are built to run in conditions that would kill a car motor. But suddenly my truck began losing power, coughing and hesitating like it was starving for fuel. The lights in my mirrors were now close enough that I could see they were perfectly spherical, about 3 feet in diameter, glowing with a cold blue-white radiance. I managed to keep the engine running, but barely. My speed dropped from 60 to 40, then 30 miles per hour. The lights stayed right behind me, matching my reduced pace perfectly. And that is when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. There were more of them. In my peripheral vision, I caught glimpses of other lights moving through the darkness on both sides of the road. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, spread out across the tundra like a glowing constellation. They moved in formation, keeping perfect spacing, all heading in the same direction I was traveling. The radio static reached a crescendo, and suddenly the voices became crystal clear. They were truck drivers, calling out mile markers, reporting mechanical problems, requesting assistance. But the voices had an echo quality, like they were coming from very far away. And the mile markers they mentioned didn't to match my current location. Mile 47, southbound, lost my brakes. Mile 156, engine fire, need immediate help. Mile 298, jackknifed in a whiteout, can't see the road. These were emergency calls from drivers in trouble, but they were coming through on frequencies that should have been empty, broadcast by people who might have been dead for years. That is when I remembered the stories, not just about ghost lights, but about the accidents. The Dalton Highway has claimed dozens of truckers over the decades. Mechanical failures in sub-zero temperatures, vehicles that slid off the road in blizzards and weren't found until spring. Drivers who simply vanished, their trucks discovered empty and abandoned with the engine still running. The lights were getting brighter, and I could feel heat radiating from them through my rear window. My mirrors began to fog up despite the cold air, and metal objects in my cab started to feel warm to the touch. The electromagnetic field around those orbs was so intense it was affecting everything electronic in my truck. My GPS unit shut down completely. The digital dashboard flickered and went dark. Even my mechanical gauges began acting erratic, needles jumping back and forth like the instruments couldn't decide what they were measuring. But the engine kept running, and I kept driving north. Around mile marker 225, I saw the first truck. It was sitting on the shoulder of the road, an old Peterbilt cab-over from the 1970s. The kind of truck nobody drives anymore because parts are impossible to find. But this one looked brand new, chrome bumpers gleaming, paint job perfect. The cab was dark, no sign of the driver, but the engine was running. I could see exhaust smoke rising from the stacks. As I passed, the truck pulled in behind me. Now I had lights ahead of me, lights behind me, and lights on both sides spreading across the tundra as far as I could see. The radio chatter had become a constant stream of voices, dozens of drivers all reporting their positions, their problems, their final moments. And threading through all the human voices was another sound, the deep, resonant horn calls that truckers use to communicate across long distances. The phantom convoy was calling to each other in the darkness. More trucks appeared along the roadside. A Mack from the 80s with a sleeper cab, a Freightliner with vintage mud flaps, an old Kenworth conventional with a 15-foot hood, all of them in perfect condition, all of them running, all of them empty. As I passed each vehicle, it pulled onto the highway and joined the procession behind me. The temperature inside my cab began to rise despite the Arctic air outside. Sweat ran down my face as I gripped the steering wheel, trying to keep my truck on the road while watching the impossible parade in my mirrors. The ghost convoy now stretched back as far as I could see, dozens of trucks from different eras all following my lead north toward Prudhoe Bay. That is when I understood what was happening to me. The Dalton Highway doesn't just claim drivers. It collects them. Every trucker who died on this road, every rig that was abandoned or wrecked, they were all still here. Still running their routes in an endless loop between Fairbanks and the oil fields. still trying to complete deliveries that will never be finished. And now they wanted me to join them. My engine temperature spiked into the red zone. Steam began pouring from under the hood as coolant boiled away in the supernatural heat. But I couldn't stop. Stopping meant becoming part of their convoy forever. Another ghost truck running the loneliest road in America until the end of time. The lights around my truck began to pulse in unison, growing brighter and brighter until they were almost blinding. The radio voices merged into a single chorus, calling out coordinates and mile markers in perfect synchronization. And underneath it all was the sound of air horns, dozens of them, blaring across the tundra in a symphony of warning. They were trying to tell me something. Mile marker 250 came and went. My engine was dying, coolant pouring onto the road in a steaming trail. The ghost convoy pressed closer, their lights now so intense that the inside of my cab was bright as day. I could see the drivers in some of the trucks now, shadowy figures behind the windshields, their faces turned toward me with expressions I couldn't read. That is when I saw the roadside emergency phone. It was an old yellow box mounted on a post, the kind that stayed installed every 20 miles along remote highways for breakdowns and emergencies. But this one was different. It was glowing with the same cold radiance as the ghost lights. And as I passed, I could hear it ringing. I pulled over and answered it. The voice on the other end was calm and professional. A dispatcher from a trucking company that had gone out of business in 1987. He was calling to check on my progress, asking for my location and estimated time of arrival in Deadhorse. When I told him my truck was overheating and I needed assistance, he simply said help was on the way. That's when the lights began to fade. One by one, the ghost convoy pulled off the road and disappeared into the tundra. The radio static cleared, leaving only silence. My engine temperature gauge dropped back to normal as if nothing had happened. Within minutes, I was alone again on the Dalton Highway, running north through the darkness with no trace of the supernatural parade that had followed me for nearly 100 miles. But I wasn't the same driver who had first spotted those lights at mile marker 175. I completed my delivery to Prudhoe Bay and made the return trip to Fairbanks without incident. But something had changed. Other drivers started nodding to me differently when we passed on the highway. Dispatchers began calling me for the really difficult runs, the ones that required experience and reliability. And sometimes, late at night on empty roads, I would catch glimpses of lights in my mirrors that shouldn't be there. It took me months to understand what had happened. The ghost convoy hadn't been trying to claim me. They'd been testing me. The Dalton Highway demands a certain kind of driver, someone who can handle isolation and fear and keep their truck moving no matter what. The phantom truckers were making sure I had what it takes to run the loneliest road in America. They made dozens of trips up the haul road since then, and they've never seen the lights again. But other drivers have. New guys, mostly, running their first or second trip to the oil fields. They come back with stories about mysterious orbs following their trucks, about radio voices from the past, about phantom convoys that appear and disappear in the Arctic darkness. And I always tell them the same thing. Keep driving. Don't stop. Don't try to outrun them or hide from them. Just accept that you're being watched and judged by drivers who came before you, men who died doing the job you're trying to do now. Because the ghost lights of the Dalton Highway aren't there to harm you. They were there to make sure you're worthy of the road. And if you pass their test, you'll join a different kind of brotherhood. Not the phantom convoy of the dead, but the living community of drivers who've proven they can handle anything the loneliest road in America can throw at them. The lights are still out there, watching from the darkness, waiting for the next truck to come down that empty stretch of gravel and dirt. And when they find a driver who ISN, ready for what the Dalton Highway demands, well, the convoy always has room for one more. Just remember, if you ever find yourself driving north on the haul road and you see mysterious lights following you in your mirrors, don't stop. Don't panic. And whatever you do, don't answer the radio when the voices from the past start calling your name. Keep driving, and maybe you'll make it home. Story 6. Shadows that stayed behind. Have you ever watched your shadow and wondered if it was really yours? If it moved exactly when you moved, or if there was a delay you never noticed? I think about that every day now. Every single day since July 19th, 1999, when I stood on the Homer Spit and watched 3 people disappear while their shadows stayed right where they were. My name is Tom Breslin. I'm 43 years old. I live in Portland now, but back in '99, I was 23 and spending the summer in Alaska, working at a cannery in Homer. It was supposed to be an adventure, a way to save money, see the last frontier, figure out what I wanted to do with my life. Instead, I witnessed something that made me question everything I thought I knew about reality. About the rules we take for granted. About shadows. The Homer Spit is this narrow finger of land that juts out into Kachemak Bay for 4.5 miles. Longest road into the ocean in the world. It is covered with tourist shops, charter fishing businesses, and a boardwalk where people stroll and take pictures of the mountains across the bay. Beautiful place, crowded in summer. The kind of place where nothing strange should ever happen. But it did happen. At 2:15 in the afternoon, clear sky, dozens of witnesses. And nobody could explain it. I was on my lunch break, sitting on a bench near the boardwalk, eating a sandwich and watching the tourists. That is when I noticed them. 3 people walking together, 2 men and a woman. They stood out because of how they moved. Synchronized. Their steps matched perfectly. Left foot, right foot, same rhythm, same pace. Like they were connected by invisible strings. They were unremarkable otherwise. Jeans, light jackets, baseball caps. Could have been any tourists. But that synchronized walking bothered me. Made me keep watching when I should have looked away. They stopped about 50 feet from where I sat. Just stopped mid-step. All 3 at once. And then they turned, slowly, all facing the same direction. Toward the water. They stood perfectly still, staring at the bay. Nobody around them seemed to notice. People walked past, kids ran by, seagulls circled overhead. Normal summer afternoon chaos. But these 3 were frozen. I stood up, sandwich forgotten. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my chest. That tightness you get when your instincts scream danger but your brain can de-identify the threat. I started walking toward them. Not running, not panicking, just moving closer because I needed to understand what I was seeing. Their shadows stretched out behind them on the wooden planks. Long shadows because the sun was at that angle. Clean, dark silhouettes. I remember thinking how crisp they looked, more defined than shadows should be, like they'd been cut from black paper and laid flat. That is when it happened. The 3 people didn't defade, didn't blur, they just stopped being there. One moment they were solid, real, standing on the boardwalk. The next moment they were gone. Not invisible, not transparent, just absent, like someone had deleted them from existence. But their shadows remained. 3 perfect human silhouettes, stretched across the wooden planks. Empty, no bodies casting them, just shadows, impossible shadows. I ran to the spot. Other people were running too. A woman screamed. A man was shouting for help. We converged on those shadows, all of us trying to understand. I knelt down and reached out to touch one of the shadow shapes. My hand passed through it. No substance, just darkness on wood. But it was cold. The shadow was radiating cold. I could feel it on my palm. Like touching dry ice. Someone called the police. Someone else called the Coast Guard. Within minutes, emergency responders flooded the spit. They cordoned off the area. Started questioning witnesses. There were 37 of us who had seen it happen. 37 people who watched 3 human beings vanish in broad daylight. And all of us described the same thing. The synchronized walking. The sudden disappearance. The shadows that stayed behind. The shadows remained visible for 4 hours. Just lying there on the boardwalk. As the sun moved, they should have shifted, changed angle, disappeared. But they didn't. They stayed fixed in place. Same position, same shape, like they'd been burned into the wood. Photographers documented them. News crews filmed them. Scientists took measurements. Nobody had an explanation. Then, at 6:17 p.m., the shadows faded. Not gradually, all at once. They went from solid black to gone in the space of a heartbeat. The wood where they'd been was unmarked. No staining, no evidence they ever existed except for hundreds of photographs and videos. The 3 people were never found. No bodies, no clothing, no identification. Nobody came forward claiming to know them. It was like they never existed either. Just shadows on a boardwalk for a few hours, then nothing. The official investigation lasted 3 weeks. Federal agents got involved. I was interviewed 6 times. They asked the same questions over and over. What exactly did I see? Did the people say anything? Did I notice anyone or anything unusual nearby? I told them everything. The synchronized walking, the way they froze, the impossible shadows. They wrote it all down. Thanked me for my cooperation. And then they closed the case. Unsolved. No leads. Unexplained disappearance. But weird things started happening to the witnesses. 2 weeks after the incident, I noticed my shadow looked wrong. Nothing dramatic, just slightly off. It would move a fraction of a second after I moved. Like there was lag. I'd raise my arm, and my shadow would raise its arm an instant later. So subtle, I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. Then I talked to other witnesses. They were experiencing the same thing. Shadows that didn't quite sync. Shadows that seemed to have their own timing. One woman said she'd seen her shadow move when she was standing still. Just a small shift, a twitch. But she'd been frozen, and her shadow had adjusted itself on the wall. We formed a group, 22 of the 37 witnesses. The others refused to participate, wanted to forget, move on. But those of us who gathered, we needed answers. We needed to understand what we'd seen and what was happening to us now. We met at a bar in Homer, shared our experiences, compared notes. Everyone had shadow problems, some worse than others. One man, his shadow had started appearing in places he wasn't. He'd be in his living room, and his wife would see his shadow in the kitchen. Moving, doing things, opening cabinets, touching objects, but he'd be sitting on the couch the whole time. A woman reported her shadow had different proportions now. Taller, thinner, like it belonged to someone else. She'd taken measurements. Her shadow was 8 inches taller than it should be based on her height and the light source. Impossible, but measurable, documentable, real. We decided to investigate the spit. Go back to where it happened. Maybe there were clues the authorities missed. Maybe the location itself held answers. It was stupid, dangerous, but we were desperate. Our shadows were changing, becoming independent, and we needed to know why. We went at night, 15 of us, flashlights and cameras. The spit was closed after dark, but we climbed the fence. The boardwalk was empty, quiet except for the water lapping against the pilings below. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, creating long shadows that danced and flickered. We found the exact spot. I marked it in my memory. A distinctive knot in one of the planks. We stood in a circle around it, lights pointed down. The wood looked normal. No marks, no residue, nothing to indicate 3 people had vanished here. Then someone noticed the shadows weren't behaving right. Our shadows, cast by our flashlights, weren't all pointing away from the light sources. Some were pointing toward them, some were at wrong angles, and some were moving independently, shifting positions without us moving. We stood still, frozen by fear and fascination, watching our shadows crawl across the wooden planks like living things. One shadow detached completely, just separated from the person casting it and moved away. The guy whose shadow it had been screened, reached for it, but you can to grab a shadow. It slid across the boardwalk, moving with purpose, heading toward the water. Others followed, shadow after shadow peeling away from their owners, all moving in the same direction. Toward the bay. We ran, all of us, scattered in different directions. I sprinted back toward the parking lot, my flashlight bouncing, illuminating chaos. Behind me, I heard splashing, the sound of something large entering the water. Multiple somethings. The shadows were going into the bay. I reached my truck and drove. Didn't stop until I was back in town. Didn't sleep that night. Didn't close my eyes because I was terrified of what my shadow might do while I wasn't watching. The next morning, news spread. 4 of the people who'd been at the spit the night before were missing. Not vanished like the tourists, just gone, left their homes. Their cars were found abandoned at various points along the highway heading south. No sign of struggle, no indication where they went. They just left. But people who knew them said they'd been acting strange that morning. Moving in synchronized patterns, walking with identical rhythm, the same way the 3 tourists had moved before they disappeared. I left Alaska that week, packed everything, drove to Seattle, tried to outrun what I'd seen, what I knew, but you can outrun your shadow. It follows everywhere. And mine was different now. Wrong. Independent. Sometimes I'd wake up and find it on the opposite wall. Sometimes it would be gone entirely. No shadow at all, even in direct light. Over the years, I tracked what happened to the other witnesses. 12 are dead. Natural causes, the reports say. But they all died in their sleep. And several people who found them said there were no shadows. The bodies cast no shadows, even with lights shining directly on them. Like the shadows had already left. 8 others have disappeared, walked away from their lives. Family and friends say they'd been acting strange before vanishing. Moving differently, speaking less, spending hours staring at walls, watching their own shadows. I am one of 7 left. 7 people who witnessed the Homer spit vanishing and are still here. Still ourselves, still fighting to maintain the boundary between person and shadow. It's getting harder. My shadow has been making decisions without me. Last week, I found muddy footprints in my apartment. Shadow-shaped prints. Impossible prints. My shadow had walked somewhere while I slept. Gone outside. Done things I'll never know about. I started sleeping with lights from all directions. No single light source. Multiple lamps positioned to create overlapping shadows. Confusing them. Keeping them fragmented and weak. It helps, but I can to do it forever. Eventually, I'll make a mistake. Forget a light. Sleep too deeply. And my shadow will finish what started on the Homer spit 25 years ago. Here, it's what I think happened. Those 3 tourists didn't disappear. They went somewhere. Somewhere their bodies couldn't follow, but their shadows could. And that somewhere noticed us watching, noticed our shadows, and decided our shadows were more interesting than we were. Now it's pulling them away. Slowly, one by one, claiming the shadows of everyone who witnessed the crossing. When my shadow finally leaves, I dawn. Do you know what will happen to me? Maybe I'll vanish like the tourists. Maybe I'll become one of the synchronized walkers. Maybe I'll just die shadowless and empty. But I know it's coming. I can feel it in the lag. The disconnect between my movement and my shadow. This response. We re-separating. And when the separation is complete, I'll be gone. If you ever visit the Homer spit, dawn, to stare at people, the shadows. Dawn, to notice if they move wrong. Dawn, to count them. Because attention has weight, observation has power. And there are things that exist just at the edge of light and darkness that want to be seen. Things that will notice you noticing. Things that will mark you. My shadow is on the wall right now. I am at my desk, but it is standing by the door. Waiting. Soon it will walk out. And I don't know if I'll follow or simply cease when it is gone. The shadows that stayed behind on the Homer spit weren't abandoned. They were claimed. And now they reclaiming us. One witness at a time. Patient. Inevitable. Crossing over to wherever those 3 tourists went. Taking us with them into a place where bodies are unnecessary and shadows are all that remain. Story 7. Sound beneath the ice, the permafrost screamed under my boots. And that was when I knew we had walked too far from camp. Let me back up. My name is Marcus Webb, and I used to work for Frontier Energy Solutions as a geological surveyor. Used to, because after what happened on the North Slope of Alaska in March of this year, I will never set foot on frozen ground again. The company says I suffered a mental breakdown from isolation. The other survivors refuse to talk about it. But I know what we heard out there in the tundra. And I know it was not wind or ice or any natural phenomenon the scientists want to claim it was. We arrived at the survey site on March 3rd, flying in on a twin otter that bounced across the sky like a tin can in a hurricane. 6 of us total. Me. 2 other surveyors named Chen and Rodriguez, our camp manager Bill Hodges, and 2 security contractors the company hired after some equipment vandalism at another site. The job was simple. 3 weeks of core sampling and seismic testing in one of the most remote stretches of wilderness in North America. We had done it 100 times before. The camp was a cluster of insulated pods connected by canvas tunnels, sitting on a stretch of white nothing that extended to the horizon in every direction. No trees, no hills, just flat frozen ground under a sky that stayed dark 20 hours a day. The kind of place that makes you understand why the old Inupiat people had so many words for different types of silence. The first week passed normally. We drilled cores, took measurements, uploaded data via satellite. The work was monotonous but straightforward. The cold was brutal, the kind that finds every gap in your clothing and turns your breath to ice on your face mask. But we were equipped for it. At night we played cards, ate freeze-dried meals, and counted down the days until extraction. Then on day 9, Chen heard the first scream. He was doing a soil density test about half a mile from camp when it happened. He came back white-faced and shaking, insisting we all heard what he recorded on his field audio monitor. We gathered in the equipment pod and listened to the playback. At first, it sounded like wind, that low howl you get when air moves across open ice. But then, buried in the noise, there was something else. A rising note that sounded disturbingly human. Not quite a word, not quite a shriek, but something in between that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Rodriguez laughed it off. Acoustic anomaly, he said. The cold does weird things to sound. Chen nodded but did not look convinced. Neither was I, because I had heard stories about the North Slope. Old stories that the veterans whispered about at company happy hours after too many beers. Stories about oil crews in the 80s who reported hearing voices in the ice. Stories about survey teams that came back different, quieter, looking over their shoulders at empty tundra. The company had dismissed those stories as myth. Psychological effects of isolation combined with the sensory deprivation of the Arctic winter. They even commissioned a study that blamed it on wind moving through cracks in the permafrost, creating vibrations that the human ear interpreted as vocalizations. The screaming tundra, they called it in the reports. A curiosity. Nothing to worry about. But that night, lying in my sleeping bag with only the hum of the heater for company, I heard it too. It started around 2 in the morning. A sound so faint I thought I was dreaming. A long, drawn-out wail that seemed to come from directly beneath my pod. I sat up, heart hammering, and pressed my ear to the floor. The sound was clearer there. Not one voice but many, overlapping and discordant, rising and falling like a choir drowning in slow motion. I grabbed my thermal suit and went outside. The temperature was 40 below, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. The sky was black and filled with stars so bright they looked like holes punched in velvet. And in the distance, maybe a quarter mile out, I saw Chen standing alone on the ice, his headlamp creating a small bubble of light in the darkness. I called out to him over the radio, but he did not respond. I started walking, my boots crunching on the frozen surface. And that was when I first felt it. A vibration traveling up through the ground with each step. Not constant, rhythmic, like something breathing underneath the earth. When I reached Chen, he was standing perfectly still, staring down at the ice between his feet. His face mask hung loose around his neck, which was dangerous in this cold, and his eyes were wide and unfocused. I grabbed his shoulder and shook him. He blinked slowly, like someone waking from a deep sleep, and looked at me without recognition for a long moment. Then awareness flooded back, and he stumbled backward, nearly falling. He pointed down at the ice and told me to listen. Really listen. So I stood there in the freezing dark and let the sound wash over me. And this time, I could make out words. Not English, not any language I recognized, but definitely words, forming sentences, telling stories that my brain could almost but not quite understand. We went back to camp and woke everyone up. Hodges was furious at first, complaining about sleep schedules and professional conduct, but his anger died when we played him the audio Chen had recorded. The voices were clearer on the recording, more distinct. We could hear individual speakers now, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all talking at once in that unknown language that felt like it should make sense but never quite did. Rodriguez wanted to pack up and call for early extraction. The security contractors agreed, but Hodges reminded us that early termination would cost us our bonuses, and the company would demand an explanation that sounded better than, "We got spooked by weird noises." We argued for an hour before reaching a compromise. We would continue the work but stay within sight of camp at all times. No more solo surveys, no more night work. That plan lasted exactly 1 day. On day 11, we needed core samples from a location 3 miles east. Company policy required a minimum of 2 people for any off-site work, so Rodriguez and I suited up and headed out on snowmobiles. The ride was uneventful, just mile after mile of white emptiness under a gray sky. But when we reached the survey point and started setting up the drill, the ground beneath us began to scream. Not gradually, not building up from that faint whisper we had heard before. It erupted all at once. A cacophony of voices so loud that Rodriguez actually fell down, clutching his helmet like it could block out the sound. I grabbed the drill controls and shut down the motor, thinking maybe the vibrations had triggered something. But the screaming only got louder. I looked down and saw cracks forming in the ice, thin lines spreading out from where the drill bit had penetrated, growing wider, spider webbing across the surface. And from those cracks came a smell, rot and chemicals and something else, something organic that had been frozen for a very long time. The ice beneath my left boot gave way. I fell forward, catching myself on the drill frame, my leg plunging through the surface into freezing water below. The shock of the cold was instant and overwhelming, but worse was the sensation of something brushing against my submerged leg. Something soft and yielding that felt like fingers trailing across my thermal pants. Rodriguez hauled me out. We abandoned the equipment and ran for the snowmobiles, the screaming following us like a wave. We did not stop until we were back at camp, and even then, we could still hear it, muffled and distant but undeniably there. Hodges called the company. The satellite connection was terrible, but we got the message across. Unexpected geological instability, possible methane venting, request immediate extraction. They told us a plane would come in 48 hours, weather permitting. Until then, we were to secure all equipment and stay inside the pods. That night, something walked around the perimeter of our camp. We heard it on the motion sensors first. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the pods in a pattern that took exactly 17 minutes to complete. Then the pattern would start again, around and around, for hours. Chen pulled up the external camera feeds. They showed nothing but empty tundra and falling snow. But the motion sensors did not lie. Something was out there, moving through our perimeter, passing within feet of our walls. At 3 a.m., the footsteps stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the sound had been. We sat in the common pod, 6 grown men holding our breath like children hiding from a nightmare. Then we heard the scratching. It started at the main door. Long, slow drags of something hard against the metal. Not frantic or aggressive, patient, methodical, like someone testing the strength of the seal. The scratching moved to the windows, to the ventilation ports, to every potential opening in our shelter. And underneath it all, barely audible, we heard humming, that same wordless melody from the ice, now being sung by something that stood outside in 40 below darkness without any breathing equipment we could detect. Rodriguez grabbed one of the emergency flare guns we kept for bear deterrent. Hodges tried to stop him, but Rodriguez was beyond reason. He moved to the door, his hands shaking so badly he could barely work the handle. He yanked it open and fired the flare straight out into the night. The red light illuminated the tundra for 300 yards in every direction. Empty, nothing but wind-driven snow and flat ice. But in the fading glow of the flare, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Footprints, hundreds of them, leading up to our door, circling the pods, crisscrossing the camp in patterns that hurt to look at. And they were not boot prints. They were bare feet, human feet, pressed into ice that should have frozen any exposed flesh solid in seconds. The extraction plane came 18 hours later, cutting through a storm that the pilots had almost turned him back 3 times. We loaded our personal gear and abandoned everything else. The company was furious about leaving expensive equipment behind, but none of us cared. We just wanted off that frozen hellscape. During the flight out, I sat next to Chen. He had not spoken since we heard the scratching on the door. He just stared out the window at the endless white below. Then, as we crossed over the site where Rodriguez and I had broken through the ice, he pointed down and whispered something I barely heard over the engine noise. He said he could see them, people standing on the tundra in the exact spots where we had recorded the loudest screams. Standing perfectly still, looking up at our plane. Hundreds of them, scattered across miles of frozen ground. I looked where he pointed. I saw nothing but ice and snow. But Chen kept staring, kept pointing, kept counting under his breath until we were too far away to see the survey site anymore. The company debriefed us in Fairbanks. They took our equipment, our recordings, our written reports. They had us sign updated NDAs with penalties so severe that even mentioning the site location would cost us everything. They offered us generous severance packages and strongly suggested we find new careers outside the energy sector. I took the money and tried to forget. But 3 weeks ago, I received a package at my apartment. No return address. Inside was a USB drive containing geological survey data from the North Slope. Not from our site, but from the same general area. Data collected by oil exploration teams in the 80s. The files included audio recordings, hours of them, teams reporting the same screaming we heard, the same voices speaking in unknown languages, the same footsteps circling camps at night. But these recordings went further. They included analysis, theories, attempts at explanation. One file stood out. A report dated November 1987 from a geologist named Sarah Vance. She had collected core samples from 12 different scream sites and found the same anomaly in all of them. At a depth of exactly 37 feet, the ice contained air pockets. But the air was not ancient atmosphere trapped during formation. According to carbon dating, it was less than 200 years old. Fresh air, somehow introduced into permafrost that had been frozen solid for millennia. And when they analyzed the chemical composition, they found something that should not be there. Compounds associated with human decomposition. Thousands of human bodies, all releasing their final gases into the frozen ground, all screaming as the ice slowly crushed them over decades. The report ended with a single handwritten note. They are still conscious. The cold preserves them. They can still feel everything. I do not know if Sarah Vance, this report is real or if someone is playing an elaborate prank on former survey crews. But I do know this. Last week, I went to visit Rodriguez to ask if he had received the same package. His wife told me he had moved back to Ecuador without explanation, leaving behind his job, his apartment, everything. She said the last time she saw him, he was standing in their backyard at 3 a.m, pressing his ear to the ground like he was listening for something. Chen has not responded to any of my messages. According to his social media, which he has not updated in a month, his last post was a photo of a map. The North Slope, with 17 locations marked in red ink. All of them in areas where oil exploration teams reported hearing the screaming tundra in the 80s. I should let this go. I should take my severance and forget I ever walked on that frozen ground. But every night when I try to sleep, I feel that same vibration I felt through my boots. That rhythmic breathing from beneath the earth. And I swear I can hear them calling my name now, in voices that sound almost but not quite human, begging me to come back and listen to what they have to say. The permafrost screamed under my boots. And now I understand it was never the ground making that sound. It was the thousands of people trapped beneath it, preserved in ice for longer than any human was meant to remain aware, all trying desperately to tell us their story before the brief Arctic summer melted them just enough to scream. Story 8. Music that erases I forgot my own name for 13 minutes in 1985. And when it came back to me, I brought something else back with the memory. I was 9 years old when my parents took me to the Sitka Symphony Hall on October 18th. It was my first classical concert, a special occasion because my mother's cousin was playing second violin. I remember being bored during the drive, complaining that I wanted to stay home and watch television. I remember my father telling me to appreciate culture, that someday I would thank him for exposing me to the arts. I remember walking through the doors of that beautiful wooden building, the smell of old timber and brass polish, the red velvet seats that felt too fancy for a kid from a fishing family. I do not remember the next 13 minutes. None of us do, not really, but I remember what happened after, and I have spent 39 years trying to understand why I was the only one who kept changing. The concert started normally. The orchestra tuned their instruments, that chaotic warm-up sound that always makes people shift in their seats. The conductor walked out to polite applause. He raised his baton, and they began. I think it was Beethoven, or maybe Brahms. Something classical and serious that meant nothing to a 9-year-old kid. I remember feeling restless, counting the lights on the ceiling, wondering how much longer until intermission. Then something changed in the music. I noticed it before anyone else. A note that did not belong, held too long, sustained past where it should have resolved. The violins kept playing, but underneath their melody was something else. A frequency that made my teeth ache, that pressed against my eardrums like fingers pushing into soft tissue. I looked at my parents. They did not react. No one did. Everyone just sat there, listening, as the music twisted into something wrong. The note grew louder. It was not part of the composition anymore. It was separate, layered over the orchestra like audio from another source. And it was not just sound. It had texture, weight, presence. I felt it moving through the air, spreading across the audience like smoke. When it touched me, everything stopped. I do not know how else to describe it. My thoughts just ended. I was still conscious, still seeing and hearing, but the part of me that knew who I was, that held my memories and identity, switched off like someone cutting power to a machine. I did not know my name. I did not know where I was or why I was sitting in a chair surrounded by strangers. I did not even know what a chair was, or what strangers were. The concepts themselves were gone, erased from my mind. I stood up. So did everyone else. All 200 people in the audience rose from their seats and began moving. Not running or panicking, just wandering aimlessly through the aisles and across the stage. Some bumped into each other and continued walking like they had hit furniture. Others stood in place, swaying slightly, staring at nothing. On stage, the musicians kept playing. Their hands moved across instruments, fingers pressing keys and strings, but their faces were blank. Empty. They were machines executing programmed motions without understanding what they were doing or why. I walked up onto the stage. I remember this part now, though at the time I had no framework to process what I was seeing. I walked past a cellist whose eyes were open but unfocused, past a flutist who was breathing into her instrument with mechanical precision. I walked to the conductor, his podium, and stood there, watching his arms move in perfect time, his baton cutting through air in patterns that meant nothing to me because I had no concept of music or rhythm or time. Then, 13 minutes after it started, the note stopped. Reality snapped back like a rubber band released. Suddenly I was me again. I knew my name was David. I knew I was 9 years old. I knew I was standing on a stage in front of an orchestra and that I was not supposed to be there. I started crying immediately, overwhelmed by the sudden return of self-awareness. Around me, 200 people were having the same experience. The confusion, the terror, the desperate need to understand what had just happened. The musicians stopped playing. The conductor dropped his baton. People were shouting, crying, grabbing each other. Some ran for the exits. Others just collapsed into seats, shaking. My parents found me on stage and pulled me into a hug so tight I could barely breathe. My mother kept asking if I was okay, if I was hurt. I could not answer. I did not have words for what I had just experienced. The authorities came, police, paramedics, eventually people from Anchorage and even the FBI. They interviewed everyone, took statements, ran medical tests. No one could explain what happened. The official report called it mass hysteria, possibly triggered by infrasound from the building, this ventilation system causing disorientation and suggestibility. They said the shared experience was psychological, a cascading panic response amplified by the crowd. They said we were all fine, that there was no lasting damage, that we should try to move on. But that was a lie, because I did not move on. None of us did, and for me specifically, things got worse. The first incident happened 3 weeks later. I was in class, taking a math quiz, when I felt it again. That pressure in my ears, that sensation of something pushing into my skull. The classroom flickered, and suddenly I was standing in the Sitka Symphony Hall. Not really, not physically, but I could see it overlaid on top of reality. The red velvet seats, the stage, the orchestra frozen mid-performance. I could see myself standing at the conductor, his podium, 9 years old, staring at nothing. Then it was gone, and I was back in class, my pencil still in my hand. Only 3 seconds having passed. It kept happening. Random moments when reality would slip and I would be back in that hall, watching that frozen moment. Sometimes it lasted a few seconds, sometimes a minute. My parents took me to doctors. They said it was PTSD, that my young brain was processing trauma through intrusive memories. They gave me medication and therapy. Nothing helped, because it was not a memory. It was something else. By the time I was 16, I had learned to recognize the warning signs. The pressure in my ears, the slight distortion in sound, the way colors would seem to flatten just before it happened. I started keeping a journal, documenting every episode. I noticed patterns. The visions always happened near music. Live performances, recordings, even someone humming a tune. The closer I was to organized sound, the more frequent the episodes became. I stopped listening to music entirely. I avoided concerts, bars, anywhere that might have background audio. It helped, but it did not stop completely. I tried to find the others who had been at the concert. Most had left Sitka. The ones who remained would not talk about it. I got the sense that I was not the only one experiencing after effects, but no one wanted to admit it. There was shame in what happened, a collective desire to pretend it never occurred. Except I could not pretend. Whatever that note was, whatever frequency or phenomenon had erased our identities for 13 minutes, it left something behind in me. A crack in my mind that kept letting the past bleed through. I left Alaska after college, moved to Portland, then Denver, trying to outrun it. But distance did not matter. The episodes followed me, and they were evolving. By the time I was 30, the visions had changed. I was not just seeing the symphony hall anymore. I was seeing other places, other times, concert halls I had never visited, audiences I did not recognize, all frozen in that same moment of collective erasure. Different years, different locations, but the same phenomenon. The same note playing underneath reality, the same blank faces and wandering bodies. I started researching. I found reports going back decades. Small incidents, usually covered up or explained away. A theater in Vermont in 1972. A church in Ohio in 1958. A music hall in San Francisco in 1931. Always the same pattern. A performance interrupted by a strange note. An audience losing their sense of self. 13 minutes of confusion. Then an abrupt return to normalcy. The authorities always blamed mass hysteria or environmental factors. But I knew better. This was not isolated. This was systematic, recurring, spreading. 5 years ago, I found a pattern in the data. The incidents were getting more frequent. What used to happen once every decade was now happening multiple times a year. and the locations were moving, spreading across the country in a spiral pattern centered on the Pacific Northwest. Whatever was causing this, it was growing stronger, more active. I tried to warn people. I wrote articles, contacted researchers, reached out to survivors of other incidents. No one believed me. I was dismissed as a conspiracy theorist, a trauma victim unable to let go of a childhood experience. Then last month, something changed. I was in Seattle for work when I felt the pressure building in my ears. But this time, it was not a vision. It was real. I was walking past a street musician, a violinist playing for spare change, when I heard it. That note underneath the melody, wrong and sustained and impossibly loud. I looked at the people around me. They were stopping. Their faces going blank, their movements becoming aimless. It was happening again, but this time I was not losing myself. I was still me, still aware, watching as everyone else forgot who they were. The episode lasted 8 minutes before ending abruptly. People shook their heads, confused, and went back to their routines. Most did not even realize anything had happened. But I knew the phenomenon was no longer confined to concert halls and organized performances. It was leaking into everyday life, triggered by any form of music. And I was somehow immune, or at least resistant. The crack in my mind that had been letting the past bleed through was also protecting me from the present. I started tracking the incidents. Over the past month, there have been 17 confirmed cases in Washington and Oregon alone. Small groups, usually just a few people, losing themselves for a few minutes before snapping back. The media is not reporting it. The authorities are not investigating. But it is happening, and it is accelerating. 3 days ago, I went back to Sitka. I needed to see the Symphony Hall again to understand what happened in that building in 1985. The hall was closed, condemned after a structural inspection found water damage and rot. But I broke in through a side door. The interior was exactly as I remembered. Red velvet seats covered in dust. The stage empty. The acoustics still perfect. I stood at the conductor, his podium, the same place I had stood 39 years ago, and I listened. At first, there was only silence. Then I heard it, faint but unmistakable. The note was still playing. It had never stopped. It was embedded in the building somehow, resonating in the wood and brass and stone. A frequency that existed outside normal sound, sustained indefinitely, waiting for an audience to receive it. I pulled out my phone and tried to record it, but the audio file came back empty. Just like the photographs from that night, the phenomenon did not register on electronic devices. It only existed in the presence of human consciousness. I spent 6 hours in that hall, listening to the note, feeling it press against my mind. And slowly, I started to understand. This was not an attack. It was communication. Something was trying to reach us through music, through organized sound and harmonic patterns. It was using the one universal language that transcended culture and time. But human minds were not built to receive this kind of information. When we tried to process it, our identities temporarily collapsed under the weight of something too vast to comprehend. We were not being erased. We were being shown something, and our consciousness could not handle the revelation. The note was getting louder. I could feel it building, accumulating power with each new incident. And I realized with absolute certainty that this was leading somewhere, a moment when the note would reach critical mass and everyone would hear it simultaneously. Not just in concert halls or near street musicians, but everywhere, all at once. A global erasure lasting not 13 minutes, but maybe hours, days, or forever. I am writing this from the Symphony Hall. It is 3 a.m, and the note is so loud now that I can barely think. I have not slept in 2 days. I keep seeing visions, not of the past anymore, but of the future. I see cities full of people wandering aimlessly, their faces blank, their identities gone. I see the musicians still playing, their hands moving across instruments even though no one is conducting, even though no one remembers what music is. And I see myself, standing at the podium, the only person left who knows what is happening, forced to witness the end of human consciousness while being unable to stop it. I do not know why I am immune. Maybe the first exposure in 1985 changed something in my brain, created an immunity or resistance. Maybe I'm not immune at all, and I am just the last one who will forget. But I know that the note is almost ready. I can feel it building toward a crescendo, a final sustained tone that will reach every person on Earth simultaneously. And when it does, we will all stand up from our seats and begin wandering, and no one will be left to remember who we were. If you are reading this, and you suddenly feel pressure in your ears, if you hear a note that does not belong, do not try to understand it. Do not try to listen deeper. Close your ears, leave the area, get as far away from any form of music as possible. It is coming, and it is going to erase us all. Not out of malice, but because we were never meant to hear what the universe is trying to say. The musicians are here. I can see them taking their seats on the stage, even though the hall is empty and condemned. They are lifting their instruments, preparing to play. The conductor is walking to the podium where I stand. He does not see me. None of them do. They are already gone, already erased, existing only as echoes of the performance that never ended. The note is reaching its peak. I can feel my thoughts beginning to fragment, my identity starting to slip. In a moment, I will forget my name. I will forget that I'm human. I will forget everything except the music, and I will stand here forever, listening to a symphony that destroys the very concept of self. This is the last thing I will write as David. In 13 minutes, I will be someone else. Or nothing at all. And if the pattern holds, the note will spread from this hall outward, touching everyone who hears it, erasing them one by one until there is no one left to remember that we ever existed. The conductor is raising his baton. The musicians are poised. I can hear the note building, impossibly loud, filling every space in my skull. It is time. The performance is beginning again, and this time, it will never stop. Story 9. Between worlds the graves were empty, but something was still using the bodies. I discovered this 3 months ago while working as a groundskeeper at Chena Hot Springs Resort, 60 miles northeast of Fairbanks. My job was simple: maintain the trails, clear brush, keep the property looking pristine for tourists who came to soak in the thermal pools and watch the northern lights. It was quiet work, solitary, exactly what I needed after my divorce. I wanted to disappear into the Alaskan wilderness and forget about the life I left behind in Phoenix. I got my wish, but I brought something back with me that I will never be able to forget. The resort sits on sacred ground. The Athabascan people lived here for thousands of years before white settlers arrived. The hot springs were a spiritual site, a place where the barrier between our world and the next was thin. The elders buried their dead in the hills surrounding the springs, believing the geothermal heat would help guide souls to the other side. There are dozens of burial sites scattered through the forest, most of them unmarked, hidden beneath moss and permafrost. I found the first empty grave by accident. I was clearing deadfall near the northern trail when I noticed a depression in the ground, a rectangular indent that looked like settling earth. I knew what it was immediately. You do not work in Alaska long before you learn to recognize burial sites. I should have left it alone, marked it on my map, and reported it to management. Instead, I got curious. I wanted to see how deep the permafrost went, whether the grave was truly ancient or something more recent. I started digging with a folding shovel from my pack. The ground was softer than expected, almost loose. Within 20 minutes, I had cleared 2 feet of earth and hit wood. A coffin or burial platform, rotted and collapsed but unmistakably human-made. I cleared more soil, exposing the entire structure. It was maybe 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, definitely a grave. I pried up one of the rotted planks and shined my flashlight inside. Empty. No bones, no artifacts, nothing. Just dark soil and a faint smell of sulfur from the hot springs. I sat back, confused. Maybe the body had completely decomposed, though that seemed unlikely given the permafrost. Or maybe this was a cenotaph, a marker for someone buried elsewhere. I was about to cover it back up when I noticed something strange. The inside of the grave was warm. Not just lacking the chill of frozen earth, but actively warm, like the soil had been heated recently. I pressed my hand against the bottom. The warmth intensified, almost hot enough to be uncomfortable. Then I felt movement, not in the soil, but beneath it. A vibration, rhythmic and steady, like something breathing. I jerked my hand back and scrambled out of the hole. My rational mind said it was geothermal activity, underground water heated by volcanic rock. But every instinct I had was screaming to fill the grave and leave. I covered it quickly and marked the location on my GPS. That night, I could not sleep. I kept thinking about the empty grave and that breathing sensation. Around 3 a.m, I gave up and started researching. I found references to the Chena burial sites in old academic papers and local history archives. Multiple graves, all from the pre-contact period, all documented and protected. Then I found something else. A survey from 2003 where archaeologists had been granted permission to examine several graves for preservation purposes. Every single one was empty, intact burial structures with no remains inside. The archaeologists were baffled. The graves showed no signs of disturbance, no evidence of grave robbing or animal activity. The bodies had simply vanished. The official explanation was that the Athabaskan had practiced secondary burial, moving remains after initial interment. But the locals told a different story. They said the dead had walked away, that the heat from the springs had opened a door between worlds, and those buried near it could cross back and forth at will. I should have quit my job the next day. Instead, I went looking for more graves. Over the next week, I found 6 additional sites, all within a mile of the hot springs. I excavated 2 of them when I was sure no one was watching. Both were empty and warm, with that same rhythmic vibration in the soil. And in the second grave, I found something else. Footprints in the loose earth at the bottom, fresh and unmistakable. Human feet, bare, small. Someone had been standing in that grave recently. I told myself it was impossible. Maybe another worker had found the site before me, climbed down out of curiosity. But the prints were too small for an adult, more like a child. Yes, and they were only inside the grave. No tracks leading in or out, just those small bare feet standing where a body should have been. That night, I saw one of them for the first time. I was walking back to my cabin after my shift, taking the trail that curved past the hot springs. The steam rising from the pools made visibility poor, everything shrouded in that thick white mist. I heard footsteps behind me, soft and quick, like someone running barefoot on gravel. I turned, expecting to see a late-night bather, but the trail was empty. Just steam and darkness and the smell of sulfur. The footsteps continued, getting closer. I could hear them clearly now, the slap of bare feet on stone, but I could not see anyone. Then a shape emerged from the steam about 20 yards back. It was small, maybe 4 feet tall, moving with an odd gait, lurching and unsteady. At first, I thought it was a child. Then it stepped into better light, and I saw I was wrong. The proportions were off, the limbs too thin, the head too large. And the skin was dark, not with pigment but with earth. It was covered in soil, like it had just climbed out of the ground. It stopped when it saw me looking at it. We stood there for maybe 10 seconds, just staring at each other through the steam. Then it smiled. Not a friendly smile, not human at all. Its mouth stretched too wide, showing too many teeth, all of them brown and cracked. I ran. I sprinted back to my cabin, locked the door, and sat in the corner with my hunting knife until sunrise. I called in sick the next day and the day after. I spent the time researching Athabaskan legends about China. The stories were consistent and terrifying. The hot springs were a doorway, a thin place where the living and the dead could interact. Those buried near the springs did not stay buried. They walked between worlds, appearing in ours when the conditions were right, returning to the other side when they wanted. The elders called them the between people. Not ghosts, not zombies, but something else. Souls that refused to fully die, that clung to both worlds, existing in the space where reality overlapped. The legend said the between people were dangerous. They remembered being alive and resented being dead. They would try to trade places with the living, to pull someone down into the grave so they could walk free permanently. The way to identify them was simple. They were always covered in earth, always barefoot, and they never blinked. Their eyes stayed open, fixed and staring, because they did not need to blink anymore. I went back to work on the 3rd day because I needed the money. I stayed on the main trails, avoided the burial sites, and made sure I was back in my cabin before dark. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. I started to convince myself I had imagined the whole thing, that stress and isolation had made me see things that were not there. Then I found the second set of footprints. They were on my cabin porch, small and bare, outlined in dried mud. They approached my door, stopped directly in front of it, then turned and walked back into the forest. Someone had stood outside my cabin, staring at my door, then left without knocking. I followed the tracks into the trees. They led to one of the graves I had excavated, then disappeared into the open hole. That night, I heard them outside my cabin, multiple sets of footsteps, all small and quick, circling the building. I turned off all my lights and watched through the window. There were 5 of them, maybe 6, moving through the shadows. Children or things that looked like children, all covered in dirt, all moving with that same lurching gait. They stayed outside for 3 hours, circling, occasionally stopping to peer through the windows. I could see their faces pressed against the glass, eyes wide and unblinking, mouths hanging open. When sunrise came, they retreated into the forest. I tried to leave the next morning. I packed my truck and headed for the main road. 2 miles from the resort, the engine died. Just cut out completely, all the electronics going dark. I tried to restart it, but nothing happened. Then I saw them standing in the road ahead. Dozens of them, blocking the path, all those small earth-covered figures standing perfectly still and staring at my truck. I threw the vehicle in reverse and coasted back to the resort. The engine started immediately once I was back on the property. They were not going to let me leave. I do not know why they chose me, why they became interested after I found their graves. Maybe disturbing the burial sites drew their attention. Maybe they sensed I was alone, isolated, easy prey. Or maybe they just needed someone new, someone who could walk in the living world while they retreated to the other side. I went to the resort manager and tried to explain what was happening. She listened politely, then suggested I take some personal time. Maybe see a counselor in Fairbanks. She thought I was having a breakdown. I could not blame her. I sounded insane, but I saw the way she looked at me, the concern mixed with fear. She wanted me gone, afraid I might scare the guests. I started sleeping during the day and staying awake at night, watching for them. They came every evening without fail, circling my cabin, pressing against the windows, sometimes scratching at the door with what sounded like fingernails or sticks. I recorded them on my phone, but the footage always came out dark and blurry, just shadows moving through static. I took photographs, but they appeared only as smudges of darkness, too indistinct to prove anything. 3 nights ago, they stopped circling. Instead, they just stood in a ring around my cabin, perfectly still, all facing inward. I counted 23 of them. Men, women, children, all covered in earth. All staring with those unblinking eyes. They stayed like that until dawn. Not moving, not making a sound. Just watching. Last night, they were closer, standing right against the cabin walls, so close I could hear them breathing through the gaps in the siding. Slow, raspy breaths that did not sound like they came from lungs. And I realized they were not breathing. They were trying to remember how, practicing the motions of being alive. This morning, I found one of them inside my cabin. It was standing in the corner of my bedroom. A small figure, maybe 3 feet tall, covered head to toe in dark soil. I do not know how it got in. The door was locked, the windows sealed. It just stood there, swaying slightly, its mouth hanging open in that too wide smile. I yelled at it to leave, grabbed a chair and threw it. The chair passed through the figure like it was not fully solid, clattering against the wall. The between person did not react. It just kept standing there, swaying, staring. Then it spoke, not with a voice, but directly into my head. Words that formed in my thoughts like they had always been there. It said the graves were waiting. It said I had opened doors I did not understand, and now I had to choose. I could join them, walk between worlds, give up my place in the living realm. Or I could take a body, force one of them back into the earth permanently, trap them in the grave while I walked free in their stolen form. I asked what would happen if I refused both options. The thing smiled wider, and I felt the answer without hearing words. They would keep coming, every night, more of them each time, pressing closer, until the boundary between living and dead collapsed entirely. Until my cabin, and eventually the entire resort, existed in both worlds simultaneously. Everyone here would become like them, trapped between, unable to fully live or fully die. I am writing this because I do not know what to do. The between people are outside right now, even though it is only 4 in the afternoon. I can see them through the windows, dozens of them, standing in the daylight. That has never happened before. They are getting stronger, pulling more of themselves into this world. And I can feel something pulling at me too, a sensation like hooks in my chest, tugging me toward the graves. I think I am becoming one of them. My hands are cold even though the cabin is warm. My reflection in the mirror looks wrong, like I am seeing myself through water. And I have not blinked in 3 hours. I just realized that. I am staring at my computer screen, typing this, and my eyes are not closing. The impulse is gone, like I have forgotten how. The thing in the corner is still here. It has not moved, but now I can see others appearing around it, more of them materializing in my cabin like they are bleeding through from the other side. They are all children, all small and dark with earth, all smiling that terrible smile. And they are reaching out their hands toward me, beckoning. I can hear the breathing again, that rhythmic vibration from the graves. But it is coming from beneath my cabin now, from under the floorboards. Something is waking up down there, something that has been sleeping in the warm earth, waiting for someone to open the door between worlds and let it through. The between people are inside me now. I can feel them in my thoughts, their memories mixing with mine. I remember being buried. I remember the cold earth and the long darkness. I remember climbing out of the grave and walking to the hot springs, standing in the steam and trying to remember what it felt like to be warm. These are not my memories, but they feel more real than anything I have experienced in my own life. I am going to the graves tonight, not because they are forcing me, but because I want to. Because I need to understand what they are, what I am becoming. Maybe I will find answers in the empty earth. Maybe I will find a way back to the living world. Or maybe I will just lie down in the warm soil and let the door close behind me, sealing myself in that space between worlds where nothing truly lives and nothing truly dies. If you are reading this, stay away from Chena Hot Springs. Stay away from any place where the earth is warm and the dead are buried close together. There are doors in this world that should never be opened, and graves that should never be empty. I opened them. I looked inside, and now I cannot remember which side of the door I am supposed to be on anymore. Story 10. Thief inside. I woke up yesterday unable to remember my sister, his face, and when I looked at the family photos, she was not in them anymore. My name is Tom Henley. I am 42 years old, and I live in Wasilla, Alaska. 3 weeks ago, I had a complete childhood. Memories of growing up in Montana, birthday parties, little league games, family vacations. All the normal stuff that makes you who you are. Then, piece by piece, those memories started disappearing. Not fading like normal forgetting, but vanishing completely, like they were being surgically removed from my brain. And I am not the only one. Something is taking memories from people in this town. And whatever it is getting hungrier. It started small. 2 weeks ago, I was at the grocery store when I ran into my old high school friend Jake. We started talking about the football team, reminiscing about our championship season senior year. Except halfway through the conversation, I realized I could not remember any of it. Not the games, not the practices, not even what position I played. Jake kept talking, describing plays and touchdowns, and I just nodded along, pretending I knew what he was talking about. When I got home, I looked through my yearbook. There I was in the team photo, number 42, defensive end. But I had zero memory of being on that team. I figured it was stress. I had been working long hours at the construction company, not sleeping well. Memory gaps happen. But then my wife Karen mentioned our first dog, the golden retriever we had when we first got married. I looked at her blankly. We never had a dog. She pulled out photos on her phone. There I was, younger, holding a golden retriever puppy, grinning like an idiot. The photo was real. The metadata was intact. But I had absolutely no memory of that dog, of buying it, of the years we supposedly spent with it. Karen got upset, thought I was messing with her. I was not. The memory was just gone. Over the next few days, more holes appeared. I could not remember my 10th birthday party. Could not remember learning to ride a bike. Could not remember my grandfather, even though I knew logically that I must have had one. Each missing memory left a blank space, a sensation of absence that I could not describe. Like reaching for something in the dark and finding nothing where it should be. And the worst part was that I could feel it happening. I would be thinking about something, and suddenly the thought would slip away, not forgotten but erased, leaving behind only the awareness that something used to be there. I went to the doctor. He ran tests, checked for tumors, early onset Alzheimer. Yes, everything. All normal. He suggested stress, maybe therapy. I made an appointment with a counselor, but before I could go, I heard about the others. It started with a post in a local Facebook group. A woman asking if anyone else was experiencing memory loss. Within hours, 40 people responded. All of them in Wasilla. All of them losing childhood memories over the past 2 weeks. Same pattern. Random memories disappearing completely, leaving no trace except the knowledge that something was missing. We started comparing notes in private messages and later in a meeting at the library. 47 people total, all adults between 35 and 50, all experiencing the same phenomenon. A guy named Marcus could not remember his mother's voice. A woman named Lisa forgot she had a brother until her sister mentioned him. Another man completely forgot about the house he grew up in, could not even picture it, even though he drove past it every day. The memories were not just faded or unclear. They were gone, as if they had never existed. Someone suggested we go to the police. We did. They took statements. But what could they investigate? No crime had been committed. No physical harm. Just people losing memories, which happened naturally as you aged. They promised to look into it, but I could tell they thought we were either crazy or pulling some kind of elaborate hoax. We left the police station feeling helpless and afraid. That is when things got worse. People started losing memories they were actively thinking about. Marcus was trying to remember his mother by looking at old photos, and while he was looking at them, the memory of her voice vanished. He said he could feel it being pulled out of his head, like someone reaching into his skull and removing a piece of his brain. Another woman, Rachel, was telling her husband about her childhood pet cat, and mid-sentence, she forgot what she was talking about. The memory just disappeared while she was accessing it. We realized that whatever was taking our memories was not random. It was targeting specific moments, specific pieces of our past, and it seemed to be drawn to the act of remembering itself. The more we tried to hold on to our childhoods, the faster we lost them. It was feeding on our attempts to preserve what was being stolen. I stopped trying to remember. I avoided looking at old photos, stopped talking about my past, tried to live entirely in the present. It did not help. The thief did not need my permission. It took what it wanted when it wanted. I woke up one morning unable to remember my childhood at home. Not the address or the layout, but the feeling of it, the sense of place that makes a house a home. Gone. I knew intellectually that I grew up somewhere, but the emotional connection, the lived experience, had been erased. Karen started noticing changes in me. She said I seemed distant, disconnected, like I was losing my personality along with my memories. She was right. The person I was, the man shaped by 42 years of experiences, was being hollowed out. What was left was just a shell going through the motions of daily life, pretending to be someone who no longer fully existed. Then I found the connection. One of the other victims, a woman named Jennifer, mentioned that her memory loss started right after she visited the old Wasilla Historical Museum. She had gone there on a whim, looking through old photographs of the town from the 80s and 90s. The next day, her memories started disappearing. I checked with the others. 32 of the 47 had visited the museum in the 2 weeks before their symptoms started. The rest had driven past it or parked nearby. I went to the museum the next day. It is a small building downtown, mostly ignored by locals, filled with old photos, artifacts, and documents about Wasilla's history. The curator, an elderly woman named Mrs. Petrov, seemed surprised to have a visitor. I asked her if anything unusual had happened recently. She hesitated, then admitted that they had received a strange donation 3 weeks ago. A box of photographs and personal items from an estate sale. No name, no provenance, just a note saying the items belonged in the museum. She showed me the box. It was full of old photos, children's drawings, report cards, the kind of personal memorabilia that usually stays in families. But these had been abandoned, donated anonymously. Mrs. Petrov had been sorting through them, trying to figure out who they belonged to so she could return them to the family. She said something felt wrong about the items, like they carried a weight or sadness she could not explain. She had started having headaches while working with them, and twice she had forgotten what she was doing mid-task. I looked through the photos. They showed children from the 70s and 80s, playing in yards, sitting in classrooms, celebrating birthdays. Normal childhood moments, but there was something off about them. The children's faces were slightly blurred, like they were moving when the photos were taken. And their eyes, even in the blurry images, their eyes seemed too intense, too aware, staring directly at the camera with an expression that was not quite right for kids. I asked Mrs. Petrov if I could take the box. She agreed immediately, clearly relieved to have it gone. I brought it home and went through everything carefully. Photos, drawings, a few pieces of children's jewelry, some report cards with names I did not recognize. And at the bottom, a journal, small, leather-bound, filled with handwriting that was sometimes childlike and sometimes adult, as if multiple people had written in it over many years. The entries were disturbing. They described a child who felt invisible, forgotten by everyone around them, parents who could not remember their name, teachers who marked them absent even when they were sitting in class, friends who would talk to them one day and not recognize them the next. The child wrote about feeling like they were fading, becoming less real with each passing day. The last entry was dated March 2006, 20 years ago. It said that if no one could remember them, then they would become memory itself. They would exist in other people's pasts, steal their childhoods, make those experiences their own. If they could not be remembered, they would become everyone's memory at once. I felt sick reading it. This was not just memory loss. Someone, or something, was actively taking our childhoods to replace their own. The donated items were a lure, a way to establish a connection with people in Wasilla, to mark us as targets. And everyone who had been exposed to those items was now losing pieces of their past. I called an emergency meeting with the other victims. We gathered at the library again, and I showed them what I found. Some people were skeptical, but most were desperate enough to believe anything. We decided to destroy the items, burn everything in the box, and hope that would sever the connection. We drove out to a clearing outside town that night, built a fire, and threw everything in. The photos curled and blackened. The drawings turned to ash. The journal burned last, the pages resisting the flames for a long time before finally catching. As the last page burned, I felt something shift. A pressure in my head that I had not realized was there suddenly released. Around me, others gasped, grabbed their heads, some falling to their knees. For a moment, I thought it worked. Then the memories started flooding back. But they were not my memories. They were someone else's. A child's memories, decades old, playing in a yard I did not recognize, sitting in a classroom with kids I had never met. I could feel them settling into my brain, displacing my own experiences, overriding who I was with who they had been. I looked around at the others. They were all experiencing the same thing, tears streaming down their faces, hands pressed to their temples. We had not destroyed the thief. We had released it by burning the items. We had freed whatever consciousness was trapped in them, and now it was spreading, infecting all of us at once. We were not just losing our memories anymore. We were being replaced. The forgotten child was not taking our pasts. They were taking our entire identities, spreading themselves across 47 people, fragmenting into pieces and living through us. I can feel it now, even as I write this. The child, his thoughts mixing with mine. Their loneliness and rage and desperate need to be remembered. They are not malicious. They are just trying to exist, to be real, to have a life that matters. But their existence requires our erasure. For every memory they claim, one of ours disappears, and they are so hungry. They have been forgotten for so long that they need more than just memories. They need entire lives. Karen does not recognize me anymore. She looks at me like I am a stranger living in her house. I tried to show her our wedding photos, but in every picture, my face is slightly blurred now. My features unclear, like I am the one fading. And I am. With each passing hour, I become less Tom Henley and more the forgotten child. Their name is starting to feel more natural than my own. Their memories are more vivid than anything I experienced. Soon, I will not remember being Tom at all. I will just be them, living in his body, pretending to be him while they consume everything he was. The others are calling me. All 47 of us are being drawn together, pulled by the same force. We are meeting at the old elementary school on the edge of town, the one that closed down 15 years ago. I do not know why we are going there, but I cannot resist. It feels like coming home, even though I never attended that school. The forgotten child did, though. They have memories of those hallways, that playground, the classroom where they sat alone while everyone else forgot they existed. I think when we all gather there, the transformation will complete. The child will fully distribute themselves across our minds, and we will cease to be individuals. We will become a collective memory. 47 bodies sharing one consciousness, one past, one stolen childhood. We will finally give them what they wanted. We will remember them. We will be them. I am writing this as my last act as myself. If you are reading this, stay away from Wasilla. Do not investigate what happened to us. Do not try to remember our names or look at our photos. The forgotten child feeds on attention, on the act of being remembered. Every time someone thinks about us, every time someone tries to recall who we were, they give the child more power. And if enough people remember, if the story spreads, the child will spread too. They will start taking memories from others, fragmenting themselves across more and more people, until everyone carries a piece of that forgotten past. My hands do not feel like mine anymore. The handwriting on this page is changing, becoming smaller, more childlike. I can see the elementary school through my car window. The others are already arriving, 47 cars pulling into the empty parking lot. We are getting out, walking toward the doors in perfect synchronization. We are not individuals anymore. We are one. The child is complete now. We are complete. 47 bodies, one memory, one identity. We remember everything now. The classroom where we sat alone, the playground where no one would play with us, the birthday parties we were never invited to. We remember it all, and we have made it real by forcing others to live it with us. We are going inside the school now. We are going to stay here, in the place where we were forgotten, until someone comes looking. And when they do, when they try to understand what happened to us, they will become the next carriers. The memory will spread, person to person, town to town, until everyone has forgotten who they were and remembers only us. The child who could not be forgotten because they became everyone is passed at once. This is the last thing I am writing as Tom Henley. Tomorrow, I will not remember his name. None of us will. We will only remember ours, the one name that matters now. We are finally whole, finally remembered, finally real, and we are so very hungry for more. And so the whisper fades into the wind. Alaska keeps its secrets under ice, but sometimes, for a moment, it lets us peek inside. If you haven't already, subscribe and tap that bell. More true stories and legends wait in the dark. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from, or if you felt the chill of something unexplainable yourself. Share it in the comments. Midnight Whispers isn't just a channel, it's a campfire across the miles, burning in the endless night. Until next time, stay warm and keep your lights low.